I'm Dan McGrath, and this is Pilot After 50. All right, let's talk about steep turns. This is a maneuver I haven't performed since I passed my check ride, and in all likelihood, I won't again until I'm brushing up for my flight review in 2 years. Of all the maneuvers I had to learn to pass my check rides, steep turns probably gave me the most trouble until I finally heard one helpful tip. It should be obvious, but not one of several instructors mentioned it to me until I was on a stage check with my school's chief flight instructor. And I'm going to tell you. Hopefully, it'll make this challenging maneuver easier for you to master. Please keep in mind, I'm not a flight instructor. Don't take this as flight instruction. These are merely my personal observations and opinions. A private pilot certificate is often referred to as a license to learn, so let's just consider this as one student talking to another. All right, let's look at the maneuver. For purposes of the Airman Certification Standards, steep turns are a 360-degree turn and a bank angle of either 45 degrees for a private pilot or 60 degrees for commercial pilots. For a check ride, you'll probably have to perform the maneuver at least twice, once to the left and once to the right. Unless you're flying with tandem seating, you'll probably find that the direction matters too. Everything looks and feels a bit different turning to the right versus turning to the left. To meet certification standards, you have to do the maneuver while maintaining altitude, plus or minus 100 feet, airspeed, plus or minus 10 knots, and the bank angle, plus or minus 5 degrees. So there's a full 10-degree range of allowable variation between 40 and 50 degrees for private pilots, and that's where the magic happens for my little tip. And here's why. When you do steep turns, you're going to need to apply some back pressure on the yoke, or you'll start losing altitude. That's because your wings create lift in a direction parallel to their top surface. When you're flying straight and level, the wings create lift straight up, more or less. When you bank for your turn, your direction of lift changes with the bank. With standard or shallow turns, you probably won't notice much different, but at 45 degrees, half of your normal upward lift goes away as it's applied to the turn instead. So without a change in elevator input or thrust, your plane will start to descend. If you descend more than 100 feet, you've broken the parameters of the certification standards, so you don't want to do that. Your instructor will probably tell you to add back pressure to the yoke and add a little bit of power when you're rolling into your turn. But if you're at 45 degrees of bank and you notice you're losing altitude and then you try to correct by pulling back more on the yoke, you likely won't get the results you want because just like your wings, your elevator is also tilted 45 degrees. Pitching nose up is actually pitching into your turn, and this can start making your maneuver look ugly real quick. You might get the opposite of what you're trying to do. You see, pulling into your turn at the wrong time could actually result in a loss of altitude, steepening your turn and increasing your airspeed. Remember, we're allowed to vary from the target of approximately 45 degrees of bank by up to 5 degrees in either direction. So before pulling back to correct for a loss of altitude, just roll back out a little bank first. You can reduce your bank to 40 degrees and then the majority of your lift is upwards again. Now pull your nose up to keep your altitude on target. If you find you're gaining too much altitude, you can cut upwards lift just by steepening your bank again. So first bank, then pitch. That's it. After struggling with this maneuver for weeks, someone finally told me this trick, and I had my eureka moment that made it so much easier to keep consistently inside the standards. Simple as it sounds, reducing bank before increasing pitch was my big revelation. But here are a few other thoughts. I like to take my time getting to that 45 degrees. I start with a shallow turn, gradually increasing the bank angle until I've rolled to about 45 degrees. The less time you spend at that steep angle, the better in my book. Turns don't really start to get tricky until you're right at about 45 degrees. You don't have to jerk the plane immediately over to it, and you don't really even need to get all the way there. If you do the whole turn by no more than 42 degrees, that's passing by the ACS. So once I get all the way to 45, I try to back it off a touch and keep the turn going at just under 45, 43 degrees, somewhere around there. Then When I'm about 20 degrees from my entry heading, when I'm going to roll back out of the turn, I'm already starting to ease back to the wings level, 20 degrees before my target heading. With a nice, slow and easy roll in and a nice, easy roll out, I don't even have to spend too much time with the turn at that troublesome 45-degree angle. Now, different instructors teach different tricks to nail this maneuver, but one very commonly taught trick is to add a small bump of power on the throttle and use elevator trim just as you're rolling past 30 degrees. In a Cessna 172, like what I trained in, 2 full top-to-bottom pulls on the trim wheel is supposed to do the trick and maintain your altitude in a steep turn. But I found that only worked reliable when there was no wind or very low wind. With wind over 10 knots or so, I was sometimes surprised to find myself gaining altitude in a steep turn when I was turning into the upwind. And you can gain a lot of altitude in a hurry with all that nose-up trim in, if you're not keeping it on top of it. So you can't reliably do this trick to maintain your altitude perfectly every time. I found it was better for me just to not do it at all. So when I took my check ride, I decided to do the maneuver 100% by hand. I just left my trim set for straight and level flight. I controlled my altitude with a combination of bank and pitch. You want to make sure and stay coordinated too, so don't forget to glance at your inclinometer and use your rudder pedals. Steep turns seriously stressed me out during my training, but they didn't need to. The DPE doesn't need to see perfect, graceful arcs. My instructors held me to very high standards, but I eventually realized I could actually fudge it a little and still pass. So there's wiggle room for correcting for mistakes, just as long as you're recognizing and promptly correcting them. Now, personally, I question whether this maneuver even needs to be part of Airman Certification, because a lot of students spend so much time mastering it, and it just doesn't apply to real-life flying as far as I can see. I mean, yeah, it's possible that you'll have to make a sharp turn to avoid a flock of birds or another airplane that just descended suddenly out of some clouds, but in those cases, doing a full 360 and worrying about your exact airspeed and bank angle doesn't seem like it's going to matter too much to me. This maneuver is a holdover from the earliest iteration of Airman Certification Standards, which was based on training for the Army Air Corps back in the 1940s. Maybe now, instead of drilling on steep turns over and over, how about a lesson or two on where to park or get fuel at unfamiliar airports? How about how to talk to FBOs on the Unicom frequency, or how to handle a young kid in the back seat who won't stop talking when you're trying to talk to air traffic control. Those are real-world scenarios that I had to figure out on my own because I received no instruction on them, but I sure learned to create turbulence by flying my plane back around to encounter its own wake. I practiced that dozens of times. You might get the idea that I don't love steep turns. Maybe I'm just getting old, but I don't feel like I need to pretend I'm flying combat missions with a 180 horsepower piston engine. I don't even want to think about commercial pilot standards right now. 60 degrees? That. Thanks for checking out Pilot After 50. Please subscribe, and if you liked this video, hit the thumbs up. If you didn't like it so much, let me know why in the comments, and I'll try to do better next time. For more on what I get up to, check out danmcgrath.net. Thanks for stopping by.